Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Donnie Darko. So, the interesting thing about this movie is one, uh, I ended up watching this once when I was younger and I didn't understand the film. I was like, I don't get what this film was. Like, I think I probably did see pretty much most or most of this movie and didn't understand a lick of it. Um, but I think now that I've kind of watched this movie, I think I have a much better understanding of what all of this means. Like, I think when I was to watch it before, a lot of this stuff just kind of went over my head. It's like, what are you guys talking about? Time travel? And we have, uh, I think you just need a mature brain to just kind of really understand what's going on here. But I could be wrong. Maybe there's a 4-year-old that understood everything about this movie, and then they had some kind of real, true, legitimate thoughts about it, and was like, yeah, I really feel like Goo Goo Gaga. You know, after watching this movie, I really feel the goo in the Gaga, because 4-year-old. Anyways, so uh going into this film, the one thing, or the second thing that is to also come out of this is I kind of want to question what it meant by what is really and truly the end of the world. When, of course, you have that arm tattoo or that arm marker thing that Donnie is to have, to exactly tell us the exact date and or time that the world is going to end. Does the world, or is the world ending for just one person? Is it going to end because Donnie is not there to take out the evil that is to still exist? Uh, are there still going to be a number of Donnie's loved ones who are to die because of what has transpired? Technically, once you get towards the end of the movie, you're like, okay, wait a minute. So, this thing had to be coming from this plane. Interesting. So, you're trying to really just understand or grasp everything. So, uh, the thing that I do enjoy about this movie is when we have Donnie who is starting to combat certain kind of people, when eventually it seems like there is some brainwashing going on, or there is some kind of manipulation, or it just gets to the point where Donnie just gets so frustrated because someone is not going through something with real, true, legitimate, pure logic of whatever, and just is going into the most layman, going into the most vaguest way about approaching something, and that's where he is to just be like, no, really, you should tell these people real sound advice, or you should really just tell a person that there is 100,000 whatever different kinds of things, um, and not everything is to be just two kinds of things in the world. So, going into this spoiler term of this movie, I know that I'm not going to get this perfectly all down in a nice, neat little bow to where every second is to be exactly like the film, because there's a lot of variables in this film. There's a lot of side stuff going on that is not all about the side story. We have Roberta Sparrows, that is to be this one character that has her own little small story here, and we have certain kind of characters that have their own little small stories, like Gretchen, and eventually Patrick Swayze's character, who is Cunningham, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to digest in one fell swoop, so it might not all be perfectly coming out here within this review. Um, The interesting thing that when I watch this movie now, like kind of seeing a cluster of things that have kind of come out much more lately, or just in the last X amount of time since I've been able to watch this movie from the first time seeing it, like stuff like Death Note, like the anime Death Note, kind of makes me look at this movie and just be like, yeah, like instead of having like some imaginary person telling, uh, like instead of Donnie telling some person like, hey, like write some names down, or Donnie's telling this person to write, or Donnie's writing names down, and this person is to kill that person. Like instead, we end up having this imaginary friend supposedly that we have to question whether or not that Donnie is to be a legitimate psychic uh, because of his intelligence being so off the charts that maybe he has some brain ability that no one else possesses, or really Donnie is just so intelligent that he also might just be crazy because no one could process or understand him, or just whatever. Like like we probably get some like geniusly smart people that eventually lose their freaking mind because they're so smart and whatever. um but anyways, so, or maybe Donnie's just crazy, who knows. So maybe you can dissect it yourself and figure out whether Donnie is just so like the brain power of which this person possesses like gives him some kind of special ability, or maybe he's just freaking crazy, a loon. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below what you feel about Donnie and the way of which that this movie plays out. Hopefully, there's not everything that everyone wants to comment about. There's certain parts of this movie where I'm just like, yeah, hopefully no one comments about that. Because, yeah, like, freaking, like, there's some stuff in this movie where I'm like, they seriously had to put this in this film? Like, remembering it now, I'm like, oh, yeah, like, I remember, like, this happens to this person, but, like, I didn't think it was because of that. Okay, whatever. Anyways, so pushing on. Uh, so like what I want to like, man, I was getting to a point and then I backpedaled. Um, but yeah, f that point, I guess. So Donnie Darko, let's just kind of tee it up. Let's just go into because like if I don't get this down now, I probably never will. It'll just be one of those where I'm like, I'm trying to get the perfect like thing of things, but like it's not going as smoothly as I want it to. But that's bound to happen because it's freaking Donnie Darko. So, the teeing up part of this movie, so we end up supposedly having Donnie, who is to seemingly be sleepwalking, but while he's also supposedly sleepwalking, he's getting communication from this costumed bunny named Frank, who uh, we seem to have this person giving Donnie information supposedly from the future to eventually have good reasons for why he is doing the certain things that he is doing. Plus, I'm just kind of wondering if Donnie wasn't exactly in this world, would things still play out the way they do? Uh, Considering what all has like would we still come to the exact same moments if end of movie, so to speak, um, is kind of what I'm trying to figure out. Uh, like, is Donnie the X factor of all of this? Uh, like, is this kind of like the butterfly effect kind of scenario? If you guys remember the first Ashton Kutcher butterfly effect movie, like, does all this kind of happen with uh, reasonably, like, is Donnie causing all this, or is he to be uh, like the thing that is to make a better world? Because I don't know. So, but anyways, so let's tee this up. So what eventually happens is Donnie needs to be sleepwalking to get supposedly psychic information and to basically be told eventually where everyone is going in the world via some weird uh, like time bubble where all of a sudden like there's this bubble that like comes into the line that kind of tells where everyone is going in this movie. And so Donnie knows where supposedly everyone is going before they do, but also like does he just know that because he can figure out where they could go already? Like that's the whole like confusing thing where it's like, well, of course they're gonna go to the kitchen to get a beer. Like, of course they're gonna go into that location. Of course they're gonna go to the bathroom because it looks like they have to pee, and so on and so forth. Like we can kind of look at somebody and kind of figure out where they're going, where their lives are going to head to, based on like kind of body language. Who knows? And maybe Donnie can figure that out quicker than anyone else can. So what ends up happening is Donnie is to eventually go to school like a normal kid, and it seems like there is a part in this movie where we get these kind of enlightening videos and stuff like that, where like you kind of wonder like if you probably remember school, especially the older that you get, like if there was this kind of stuff in school where like they would have these like I think there was these kinds of videos where like probably looking back at them now they're like how could you have ever like how could this movie have helped you like been like a uh like hey guys just be happy kind of video where it's just like how can you just be happy? Like do you just have to like channel the emotional gods to just say happy, like me happy today, and then you just need to channel that power so much so and I guess like when it also comes down to it there's a lot of times where um like a lot of like they would just dumb things down and just be like hey believe just believe you're gonna be happy, like what like like no there needs to be like some kind of easier way, like it just can't like be like some like imaginary thing that you have to believe to be happy. It's weird. I don't know, like there is sometimes when really looking at stuff where like when you look at stuff when you saw as a kid and it was just like this makes no sense like looking back on it now, where how like they were thinking that they were like mentoring us or guiding us or like showing us what was the right thing to do. But then also there was like this back and forth weird thing where they were saying that like hey man drugs are cool, but then they're like hey man don't do drugs, and it's like that's kind of a mixed message, isn't it? But anyways, so pushing on, like don't do drugs kids, or young adults, maybe the elderly, maybe a goat, I don't know. So pushing on. So there kind of feels some kind of enlightening kind of thing, or but also there's like this kind of like it seems like to me some kind of brainwashing or manipulation also going in here, where all of a sudden you just have to kind of take the words of this person that is older than you, and we eventually have Donnie who's to eventually just go on and question these things, and all of a sudden they end up kind of shunning him for questioning these things. And like yeah he might go about this in a kind of negative and maybe not the best way, um but I think when you also have a time where Donnie is to be force fed all these videos and it's not really something that he believes, and you can see all the rest of the classroom that are just like God I can't wait for this to be over kind of thing. You can just tell that no one's really taking in this message, and very few probably had. Maybe one person, maybe they got one person out of like probably 30 people, and I guess that's the one real thing to get out of that. But I guess that also is to um no, let's not talk about that. Let's not go into that realm of discussion. I was thinking about something else, but like Let's not talk about that. Like, let's go into this movie. So, uh, anyways, I think it's about that customary time because I've already been talking about this for like 15 minutes. Probably not really going much of anywhere. But like I dare say, it's about that time. Uh, we also have these nice moments where eventually one girl is to feel bad about just kind of what she did, and all of a sudden how like everybody used to love these other like younger girls, and eventually we get to a point where Donnie's grabbing this girl, and just kind of telling her that like, hey, like eventually like things are gonna work out for you, and she's like, leave me alone, and she runs off. I guess things eventually did work out for her because eventually she went on to a show called WandaVision. Things worked out. Yeah, she went on to be in WandaVision because I saw on IMDb. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the girl from WandaVision. I'm like, good for her. So let's go on to this. Let's just go. Let's spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we just spoil this movie. I could have taken 30 minutes and I probably wouldn't have gotten anywhere with this film because it's that kind of movie. So let's try and like do this in the best way that I can. So in the very beginning of this movie, we have Donnie who is to just kind of wake up in this field of place of whatever, and he's to wake up and have eventually, I think the second time around, to be given this mark and this date of when the world is going to end upon his arm at this golf field the second time around. But this first time around, he is to just wake up in this field, and he ends up riding his bike um, all the way back home. So on the fridge, there is to be this one note of where is Donnie, and so when Donnie comes back home, like his parents are just like, okay, where were you? And he doesn't explain like what happened. Like he didn't say like, oh, I was sleepwalking, no nothing, whichever. And so it just seems like he ends up just kind of consistently keep continuing to wandering off at night, and I guess nobody picks it up or nobody questions it or whatever. Uh, so that pushes us on to go to this dinner scene, uh, or maybe that pushes us on to this school scene. Uh, yeah, let's go and push on to the school scene, and then we'll get back to the dinner scene. So, yeah, let's cover the school. So, uh, of course, Donnie, like everyone else, is to eventually go to school, and so it seems that there are certain kind of people that Donnie is to be affiliated with that are to be asking him to smoke. And so Donnie ends up going for a smoke, but ends up telling his younger sister, hey, like, if you tell mom about this, like, she's like, okay, like, you'll hurt my dog or whatever. And it's like, yeah, like, remember that. so so these kids go off and go to school, and we end up having this huge power ballot by Tears for Fears. So, like we have this whole kind of setup of of everybody just kind of walking around, getting us to see all like I guess the supposed star power of this film. I guess, like sure, like you end up kind of seeing Patrick Swayze, you end up seeing Drew Barrymore and a cluster of other actors that eventually you'll probably see in a number of other things at some point in time in your life if you get lucky, because you'll probably get lucky. so, so eventually, Donnie is to be having some kind of class with Drew Barrymore's character, who is to be the teacher of this said shul, and her name is to be, of course, Karen uh, Palmeroy. Sure, I'm just gonna call her Karen or Drew Barrymore because that's easy. Uh, so, uh, so they're doing this class, and all of a sudden there's to be this new girl who is to arrive, who is Gretchen, and So all of a sudden, this girl is like, well, I guess I'm in your class. And Karen is just like, well, it seems like you're in my class. It seems like you're old enough to be in my class. So all of a sudden, this girl is to now have to choose the form of her destructor, which means this girl has to choose what cute boy that she is to supposedly sit next to. And so Gretchen is to, and I want to make sure I got this name right, because I don't want to keep saying Gretchen Ross. Gretchen is to eventually, of course, like go and look around. You have all these guys that are like, choose me. And I'm like, God, like I would just be like, no, I'm never gonna sit by that kind of person. Like, if anything, like, uh, if I had to choose the form of my destructor, supposedly in a different kind of gender of things, like I would probably pick the person to sit next to that does not look back at me for 1 second. Like, okay, sit next to that person because that person could give a rip. Like, looking back at me, like, like, no, I'm not gonna be sitting next to that person. Like, I'll sit next to the person that could not give a rip. So it seems that Gretchen is to eventually sit next to Donnie Darko because of course she would, because supposedly she ends up mentioning that supposedly Darko is some kind of celebrity now. Um, Eventually, when we get into day two uh, of this whole get together, so now I think. Yeah. So we end up having dinner with the folks, and so now we have a moment where we, of course, get the coveted scenes of learning how to suck pho, and and I think Donnie ends up saying like F and whatever, and like we have these kind of like weird banter back and forth because we have kind of kids just kind of being kids. Uh, we really just have both Donnie and Elizabeth kind of bickering at the table because, of course, Donnie is just kind of mentioned about his kind of like him going to therapy and stuff like that, and how like Donnie would love to kind of just trade places with Elizabeth, um, and so on and so forth. So, and it also seems that the main reason why Donnie is going and seeing therapy is because supposedly he ends up telling Gretchen that he ended up accidentally setting some fire when he was younger, and so supposedly he can't get a license, I guess, till he's 21. So, so we have this funny dinner that ends up kind of opening this movie, which I really do enjoy. So, uh, so eventually what ends up happening is the next day is to happen. So uh, we have, of course, the moment where Donnie is to wake up in this golf field. And so we end up having this doctor, and we end up having Cunningham, who is to all of a sudden see Donnie just kind of weirdly in this part of this golf course while they're kind of going and trying to like putt away. And so they end up waking Donnie and be like, hey, buddy, like, you have a rough night? You turn into a werewolf, Sonny? So Donnie wakes up and he is to have this thing onto his arm, and so he has this like marker in his mouth for whatever reason. And so he ends up going home to eventually hearing from his folks that all of a sudden there had been uh, this airplane engine that ended up falling through their house. Like, of course, we end up having uh, like Donnie's father, who is to be Eddie, who was to have been kind of doing some late night TV watching, We end up having Elizabeth, who ended up coming home because she was, I guess, partying or doing like some kind of something with some friends. That must have been some kind of party because that's what she looks like she was dressed doing. Uh, Rosa or Rose, I want to say Rosa. Rose and Samantha, I guess, were fast away sleeping. Uh, so luckily, I guess the plane engine just crashed through Donnie's room, and luckily he was sleepwalking, or he would have been dead, supposedly. So, uh, so that tunes up the band for us to uh, now have like Gretchen, who is to basically say that if she didn't know who Donnie was, she now knows who he is because he's now a celebrity. When you kind of look way back into the later part of this film, uh, we end up having Gretchen, who is to have been at this scene uh, to see what had all gone on, and as a kind of like a technically flashback moment, let's just say. So, uh, so eventually now, like Donnie is going to school, and like supposedly now he's like this celebrity where like pretty much everybody is kind of looking at him differently, just like, hey Donnie, like they all know his name because they basically uh like there's this myth legend of this guy who should have died but didn't, so like everybody's like, yeah, like hey Donnie. Uh so at some point we end up having both Donnie and Donnie's father, who is to just be kind of driving around town to almost run over this woman that supposedly everyone in town calls Grandma Death. Supposedly, this woman is to be going on and consistently be checking her mail for whatever reason, and so the mail just never comes. And so eventually, Donnie is to try to save this old woman from getting run over, so he kind of helps her. And all of a sudden, this Grandma Death goes and tells Donnie some sweet something of nothing. So when Donnie is to eventually go to his therapy session, his therapist is to, of course, ask Donnie, like, well, hey, like, what exactly did she say? And so he ends up saying, it's like, well, she ended up saying that we all die alone. And so the therapist is trying to like figure that out. It's like, well, like, what do you feel about that? And like, do you feel that like a god does exist? And so Donnie is like mentioning, it's like, well, like there's too much research to do. There's not enough time in the world to really like dispute that or like justify that or whichever. And so like I'm not going to like say that there is going to be a god in the world when like there's no way to really just like have concrete evidence of this kind of thing. So uh so pushing on. So and here's where we get to the imperfect parts of this movie. So that eventually I'm going to F up. So we at one point in this film end up having eventually Donnie uh, going and sleepwalking, and because supposedly for a while they had like set them up to eventually go to this hotel, but then afterwards they end up kind of like remodeling like their house, like because insurance covered all of it, because it's being covered by the FAA, or just the airport, or the airport of which that this plane was involved in. Which, like, here's the goofy thing. So they bizarrely like couldn't get the serial number like from off of this thing, and they can't figure out like where this thing came from. And so like they're trying to figure it all out, but they can't figure it out. But they're also like, when Donnie and his father was in the car, like Donnie was mentioning to his dad, it's like, so wait a minute, so we can't tell anybody about this event, but but they can't tell us anything, or we can't figure it out. So so yeah, so what ends up happening is they end up kind of rebuilding the house. And so eventually, no wait, let's get this one scene down, and then I can cover this other part afterwards. So Donnie is to go to school and consistently by this one teacher, uh, who I believe her name is Farmer, Miss Farmer. Weirdly, they say that she is to be like at first I think they say like a PE teacher, but like how is she a PE teacher, or she's like gym teacher or something like that? Some weird, like they give her some title, but I didn't quite understand what that meant. Maybe like a phys ed teacher. I don't know. So we have Miss Farmer who is to do these videos that are really to supposedly like channel enlightenment or something like that. But it's really just Cunningham, who is Patrick Swayze's character, to just come on and just kind of like, to me it feels like a weird like brainwashing kind of thing, where whenever he is to just kind of say stuff, um, and whenever anyone is kind of talking here, like where all of a sudden this woman in this video is to mention that uh like she went into the mirror and didn't like what she saw, but then all of a sudden like one day like finally came around where she really looked into that mirror and was like, you know what, like I feel better about myself for some strange reason. I'm like, wait a minute, what? like okay, then maybe she found some like thing within herself to like just realize that instead of like hating what she sees in the mirror, that eventually just kind of like take that whole glass half empty, glass half full kind of thing, and maybe this supposed teachings was to help her find that glass half full thing instead of that glass half empty kind of thing about her. And maybe that's the end result of this whole like time of which that she had been with Cunningham, getting mentored and getting like told of what to do, which eventually when Donnie is to go and really uh like a like go after Cunningham and kind of just really just say like what Cunningham should have really said to all these people, like I think it's like, well, yeah, like just kind of tell them like the brutal truth instead of like coming up with some weird roundabout way to eventually have these people themselves like come up with the positive side of things. Like, and like so like anyways, like that's what kind of Donnie wanted to just kind of like say to all these people that are eventually in these videos. So all of a sudden Miss Farmer is to force all of the students to go and get all these cards, and then to lump all these things into weirdly a fear and love spectrum of things. And so eventually one like this girl named Chen goes up there and is to read her card, and she ends up putting it into the fear box. And so Donnie goes up there and he's to just be like, well, you can't just lump all these stuff into two different categories, and plus these categories were too vague, really. But like that was the thing that Mrs. Farmer was to really just kind of on it in all actuality maybe possibly get brainwashed about that that hey uh like really simplify everything. Like I think that's the real uh kind of brainwashing possible part of like the Cunningham thing was to like overly simplify your life, and maybe you'll like feel better that uh that maybe instead of to think of all the problems that you have about yourself, maybe you should just think of the positive, and that's all you should think about. I'm like, whoa. So all of a sudden, Donnie is to just take this card and start to read it, and he's to mention how like he ended up finding this wallet, but the person ended up pocketing the money themselves. And so Donnie is just like, well, like with the way that this kind of story is to present itself, I can't really come up with a real true fear love conclusion because there's too many variables. And so Miss Farmer, it feels like Miss Cunningham, right? Uh, Miss Farmer is just be like, well, if you don't complete the project, then you'll get a 0 for the day. And so eventually Donnie is just gets so frustrated with his teacher who just wants to boil all things down in an overly simplified manner, and he just can't do that. And so he's like, you know what, you can go and take this freaking card and shove it up your butt. And so that easily forces him to go to the principal's office. His parents arrive, and so the principal is to read Donnie's records and to just say like, this kid's scores are off the chart. So like, again, what is it, kid, that you were to just say to this teacher? And so Miss Farmer ends up saying what he ended up saying, and so like we have freaking Eddie, who's of course Donnie's father, who's just freaking laughing, and he's trying not to, and like Rose is just kind of dealing with this. So all of a sudden we end up having Miss Farmer who is starting to accuse Rose, like after this is all said and done, about not being a good enough parent, that her kid had turned out this way. And it's like, wow, what a garbage thing to just accuse a parent of just not good enough parenting. And it's like, I'm sorry, like this teaching curriculum is garbage, and like the way of which that she's teaching, like it's just like, okay, she's kind of controlling the way that things are to be done, and like anybody who's to just kind of dispute something or feel like life shouldn't go the way that she wants it to be in this perfect little bubble, uh like that's, I think, when eventually you start to have certain kind of teachers that eventually just retire for one reason or another. Where it's like when you start to get all these kind of complaints, or you start to get kind of this and that, then eventually you start to see certain kind of teachers retire. But anyways, so what ends up happening is after this whole thing is said and done, uh, both Eddie and Rose end up buying Jake just a ton of stuff. Like, here's a lot of stuff for you, kid. Because they actually think it was right of what he did, and like there seems to be this in like the Day After Tomorrow, where like we always have Donnie, or we always have Jake Gyllenhaal, who is to eventually have these kind of moments in these movies where he just has to be smarter than some other kind of teacher or something like that, which I like that. Like that's kind of cool. Like no like thing where like just Jake Gyllenhaal's character has to be smarter than whoever, because like that's what makes a movie interesting, is for a student to eventually have a higher IQ than possibly a teacher. And so there's some stuff that like a student can dispute or whichever, which is kind of interesting, besides kind of the normal day-to-day kind of stuff. So so pushing on. So what ends up happening, let's get to uh, now the uh, the part where Donnie is to be sleepwalking, and so Frank is to tell Donnie, it's like, well, hey, like I'm gonna kind of talk to you now. I'm really gonna tell you kind of what to do. So Donnie goes off to the school, and I guess just easily gets into the school for whatever reason, and goes and takes this axe to this water main, and so all of a sudden, like this school is now flooded with water, and so Donnie ends up taking this axe to this mascot on this school, and then ends up writing this big, I think, like spray painting that they made me do it. Whoever that is, they made him do it. Uh, the interesting thing is when afterwards, when these kids all come back into school, they end up writing on the chalkboard, they made me do it, and they end up having a question mark on Donnie Darko, but that never really turns into anything. So, and we have Frank, who's the rabbit guy, who's telling Donnie, like, hey, like, they're never going to come and figure out that you did this. So you're fine, don't worry about it. So, that eventually leads to this kind of parent town meeting where all of a sudden we have Miss Farm, because like she has to be this outspoken person compared to everyone else in this school. So all of a sudden she is to mention like something about this book that is just not quite right, and there is to be some passage within this book leading to somebody going and breaking a water main, and like she's trying to desperately come up with some kind of book that seems inappropriate for kids so that way they can get rid of these certain kind of books by having coincidentally some scene in this book with a breaking of a water main. And we start having other parents that are just like seriously, like a book was to manipulate people into this heinous act. Like I think maybe it's certain kind of teachers that have already been manipulating certain kind of students to do any number of things, like brainwashing them or whatever. Like it probably didn't take a book to cue up anybody cracking open a water main. Uh, that's for sure, because you have a certain like kind of person that wants to try to manipulate a person into feeling guilty or whichever, and Mrs. Farm does that to a T. Like she's an awful person in this movie. She's a great actor, but she's just a piece of work in this film. No offense to the actual actor. Like I'm just saying, like this character is like really interesting. So, uh, so that's like supposedly the first like interesting part of this film, where they're to eventually tell like I guess the principal of the school is to tell everybody that there's to be an investigation being put together, and that they're eventually gonna like figure everything out, and blah 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 blah. So pushing on. Not everything is gonna get perfect, so it's bound to happen. So we end up having eventually these students end up coming back into the school, and so Gretchen is to eventually have this conversation with Donnie, where Gretchen is to eventually tell Donnie uh, while they are to be walking off back home because school is canceled. Gretchen is to have this talk to Donnie that her father evidently was uh, a horrible person that ended up almost killing, I guess, her mother, and that Gretchen had to change her name and go into hiding from her father, and so that's the reason why Gretchen had to forcibly move here to this place, and the school being closed was the only way for Gretchen to eventually talk to Donnie and confide to him. Um, because eventually what ended up happening was uh, all of a sudden Gretchen was next to these two shady guys, maybe one of them being a possible Seth Rogen. Seth Rogen isn't shady, just the character that he played was. So, so, uh, so we had Donnie who tells Gretchen that, hey, school's canceled because of some flooding. Weirdly, he ended up finding that out. So Gretchen wanted Donnie to walk him home, and so he gladly did so. And so that's what helped Gretchen all of a sudden like talk about this story, uh, and like just kind of mention how like I guess these two guys that don't really like Gretchen all that much were to eventually at some point in this movie bring up uh, about that this girl has a very dark past, or a past that is to have a really harsh story. Because while both Gretchen and Donnie were doing this kind of future experiment that they could possibly put together, where supposedly you could have infants going and having these like visuals to kind of give them like pleasing visuals while they are to, I guess, rest their heads at night, where they can have a beach, like palm trees, or some kind of pleasing visual, maybe like a duck or. uh, but then eventually we have another student who's like, well, what if they put something like harmful for the kids' eyes in these things also? It's like, well, like no one would actually want to do that to their child, but I guess you eventually also have weird people out there that come up with that idea. So, uh, like I think the thing was called like IMP or IMG or something like some weird acronym that both Gretchen uh, and Donnie were coming up with some kind of future experiments. So because uh, we ended up having Gretchen coming up with that like thought process, and then they ended up channeling that into a project. Um, we also had Gretchen having to come up with some kind of paper for her class, and while like Donnie and Gretchen were kind of walking off, Donnie was like, "Well, that's easy. All you have to do is just kind of talk about uh, kind of like how like they came up with things like soap and stuff like that. Like whenever you were to like take a crap or whatever, you didn't have like hygienal kind of things to kind of like fight bacteria and stuff like that. Like you can kind of just mention that kind of thing, because eventually Gretchen is like, so like that stuff was like kind of like soap, and Donnie is like, well, yeah, like something like that. So eventually Gretchen went off and kind of, I guess, took that idea and like ran with it. So eventually she could easily like come up with a paper. So, uh, so eventually what ends up happening is, so eventually Donnie is to more and more do these events that will eventually have him think are time travel, especially when uh, Donnie is to eventually see his father get up from the couch, and all of a sudden he sees like perfectly in some kind of weird line bubble where exactly his father is going, and all of a sudden he ends up seeing his like sister kind of walk around the house, and like he sees the line bubble of where she's going, and all of a sudden Donnie's to realize that he is to get up and go somewhere, and so he ends up seeing this like kind of line bubble of where he's going, and so all of a sudden that makes really just Donnie want to see if there's any kind of rational, real, kind of practical thing of time travel, or like maybe some kind of way of like knowing things of the future somehow. So he ends up talking to uh, his like professor, who of course is to be uh, Professor Kenneth Montoff. So he ends up talking to him, and so it seems that the professor is like, well, I'm not sure if I should be saying this, but there seems to be this book about this one Roberta Sparrows, who is to talk maybe about practical application of time travel. That there might be a way of possibly like doing this somehow or another. But so the professor gives this kid this book, and so he ends up going and giving this to his parents. He's like, hey, like, grandmother death or grandma death, like, yeah, like she is to have created this book. And they're like, really? Like, that's weird. Like, so evidently she must have just lost her mind, or maybe she just figured something out and maybe she just decided to just retire afterwards. Because yeah, Donnie found some old photo of Roberta Sparrows, and he's like, wow, like, so she actually used to be like a professor here. Interesting. So uh, so eventually he ends up going, and sometime later in this movie he ends up going back to this professor, and he read the whole entire book like cover to cover. And so now he's kind of like talking to the professor and almost kind of debating certain things about um, whether or not like God already has like a set path for people, and that maybe that's what could be time travel, is somebody being able to figure out um, like God's path, and maybe that's how Donnie is to be able to do the things that he's doing, because he had been able to figure out God's path where no one else could. And so like with that kind of line of dialogue, and where all of a sudden the professor is just like, whoa, like, you know what, like, if I go any further about talking about this, I could possibly lose my job, because like we're almost talking about like if like God exists and all kinds of things, and like if like God does have like a divine like plan per second for every single person, and like everything is to maybe be programmed ahead of time and whichever, and we just don't realize it. So like it's like that's a huge like kind of minefield to go into. And so this professor is like, dude, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. Like I could probably lose my job. Like I'm not going to lose my job over like God's path discussion, because when we start to get religion into like school and stuff like that, that's where I would just be like, yeah, I'm just not gonna like, like a lot of people, like there's a lot about this movie that feels like a debate about whichever, and like I don't think I ever want to like have a debate of any part of this movie. Um, like if I were to even say anything about like, well, maybe what Patrick Swayze's doing is brainwashing his character Cunningham, like I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's just like people could be saying like, well, any number of things could be brainwashing, then just kind of therapy could be brainwashing, and so like yeah, it could be any number of things. So speaking of therapy, so eventually let's kind of push on with some kind of parts of these movies to just kind of get some certain things out of the way. So uh, Donnie is to go and see his therapist, and his therapist is to, I guess, because talking to him just can't really seem to get anywhere. So, really, this therapist is wanting to try hypnosis to try to get things out of Donnie that he probably wouldn't have normally have said. So, the therapist is to go on and just kind of talk about like Donnie's like day to day, and that maybe has he ever thought of girls, and like Donnie's like, well, yeah, like I've thought of girls. And so all of a sudden, like we have the therapist who's trying to like transition into some other kind of thing, and like to eventually talk about school, and Donnie's just on this like one track mind about thing where it's like, I'm not yeah, I fantasize about certain girls at school, and like and the therapist is like, no, like, but like, what about your family? And he's like, I don't want to f anyone of my family, and like, that's gross. It's like, so all of a sudden this like keeps going onto that one kind of path, and where all of a sudden Donnie is to all of a sudden start to unzip his pants and almost start to touch himself, and so the therapist ends up like, wake up, like this is like gone down a horrible path, where reasonably like Donnie is also just waking up with his hands down his pants. Is like, what the heck what the heck happened? Like, I would have stopped going to that therapist after that moment. Just like, what the heck did you tell me? What did you talk to me about? Especially if you're doing this without your knowledge or whatever. It's weird stuff happens in therapy sessions. So, so pushing on, like it gets to the point where eventually the therapist is to eventually talk with Donnie's parents, and is to mention it's like, well, I think we need to like amp up the kind of sessions, and I think we need to really go into much more in depth about certain things and whichever, which eventually leads to the big reveal where Donnie is to tell this therapist the truth about what had all happened, of all the things that he has done up to this point. Uh, or up to a certain kind of point, which we'll get there. Um, and I guess I'll have to say when that point is. So we have another kind of school session, I guess, some kind of enlightening thing where I'm sure probably after the whole, like, some students being accused possibly of going and doing something harmful to this school, we end up having, of course, like some kind of public speaking of certain kind of people coming in to try and help people out, or kind of like if anybody is to have like questions, they can come on down. Like Cunningham will come in and answer everybody's questions and kind of make them all feel good by the end of this whole thing. And so Cunningham goes in there and tries to like do this kind of thing that he has basically done throughout all these videos that of course Farmer is to basically have shown people. And so all of a sudden it ends up that we just start having these people that all have these questions about like how to like uh, be able to better their life. And so it seems that really Cunningham's character is to try and skirt around these questions by like trying to answer them with not actually just like straight up just saying like, well, because there's like this one question of like, well, what if I want to learn how to fight? And like we end up having Cunningham is like, well, that question kind of like kind of caught me there. Oh, like, okay, so like if you want to learn how to fight, well, like maybe you should not learn how to fight, maybe use your words. And like, and and so like all of a sudden eventually after all this where it's seen, and then like every single person who ends up asking a question, Cunningham is like, come up here, kid, like, yeah, like, clap for this kid who ended up having this question. And so eventually Donnie is to just finally get up there because of his real just true frustration uh of really just having uh like there are simple answers, but like this guy did not get to the simplest answer of just like, well, hey, like if you're not feeling good about your body, like go and lift weights. Like if you're feeling bad about your body, go and like run a mile, like go and exercise, go and like change your diet, go and whatever. Like I'm sure like for this guy, it's just like, hey, like if you don't feel good about your body, like just look in the mirror, and like eventually you'll just have to glass half full yourself, um, and just kind of think of the one parts that you do like about your body. It's like, well, like So like that's what kind of Donnie goes into of the glass, like the glass sit off to the side and just say like let's not look at that glass at all. Because Donnie comes up there and is like, Mr. Cunningham, how much money did you get paid to like be up here? And so Cunningham is like, oh, like a jokester, huh? Like like and so really Cunningham is so desperately and so quickly trying to cut this kid down, to basically say that he has um like a lot of negativity about him, and it's like, so you're just trying to cut this person down instead of trying to uh like, which I thought was weird, like he was trying to cut him off or to shut him down, to just kind of make him feel bad about coming up here and trying to give these people a rational like thing of just if like if somebody is wanting to go and fight, like go and enroll in karate. Like that's what you should really do. That's the simplest option. If you want to go and fight somebody, go in karate and learn how to defend yourself. And the thing that you should do is defend yourself. Like if you want to like if you want to improve your body, go and lift weights. Like go and do 1,000 push-ups. Uh, Go and find exercise equipment that'll work for you. Like, and we have like Donnie, who is to break down all this in a real rational way instead of what Cunningham is to really present here. And like as if like someone was going to ask him about like puberty, and like Cunningham is like, oh, puberty, that's a really difficult subject to go into. Like that was the kind of the funniest thing, whereas about all this, whereas like Cunningham was like getting to these like big like questions, and like he was to like try to like have to come up with some kind of like weird rebuttal or whatever, and he was like, oh, okay, like this one's a little like a snafu. I wasn't prepared for this one. Because like he's, I guess, used to like doing kind of adults, because I guess that's what happens on all these videos, a lot of adults. um he's ending up working with them, so like he's not used to doing and talking about these kind of issues, but like this guy is just really caught off guard with everything. I guess, I don't know, I guess that's what this character seemed to be putting off, but I don't know. So uh so eventually what ends up happening is like Donnie is to go as far as to call Cunningham's character like the antichrist and everything like that, that like this guy is to be some kind of con artist or some kind of trickster or some kind of snake oil salesman, uh, as far as information is to go, and that's why he gets really upset, and he ends up just kind of storming off. And so eventually what ends up happening is we end up having these certain kind of girls, which is actually Donnie's sister, youngest sister, who are all going to do this dance competition. We'll talk about that now. So uh, Donnie's youngest sister is to be a part of this thing called Sparkle Motion or something like that, which is so goofy. And Samantha. So what happens is there's this like dance competition thing that has Cunningham as the host, and so while that's going on, Donnie is taking Gretchen to this movie, which is the first Evil Dead film, which was like, yeah, like give me some of those scenes of Evil Dead in here. Cool. So Gretchen is to fall asleep during this film, and so Donnie is talking to Frank, who ends up taking off his face or his mask, because Donnie is just like, why are you wearing that mask? Like, why are you wearing that rabbit suit? And Frank is like, well, why are you wearing that human suit? And so uh, Frank ends up taking off the mask and ends up showing that there seems to be a bullet hole in this guy's eye. And so Donnie is to ask, like, hey, what happened to you? And the guy is to apologize. So this leads supposedly whether Donnie is to be sleepwalking or not. He heads into Cunningham's home while Cunningham is to be at this dance recital. And Donnie ends up burning this guy's home. And so afterwards, they end up finding some kind of adult. Well, they end up finding some adult film things that are very inappropriate and are very illegal. And so Cunningham ends up getting arrested because I guess he was putting together some kind of videos that he should not have. And so this guy was probably to put to jail for probably ever. And so so this dance recital. So we end up having Chen, who ends up going out there, and she's doing this kind of dance, and no one can sadly give an F, sadly enough. Like, they're just waiting for the Sparkle Motion girls to go out there for them to be like, yeah, like, yeah, like, this is kind of Mean Girls all over again. It's weird that I know that movie, but I know the film. Where all these, like, hot, like, in Mean Girls, not in this movie, in Mean Girls, we end up having all these like girls with like barely nothing of clothes on, and they're dancing it out like all seductively and whatever. And so, uh, like when we uh, when we bizarrely had like this whole dance recital, and like these girls went out and everybody's like, yeah, woo, yeah, this is great. Like, yeah, everybody's like clapping in the music and whatever. And like Notorious is being played and everybody's like, woo. So, uh, so we go on, and evidently these girls are doing so crazily good that these girls are going off to like Star Search and any billion of other things to eventually get their time on TV because they're really young kids and they can dance good enough. So Star Search they go. Or so, but all of a sudden, once Cunningham is to be arrested, all of a sudden Miss Farm is to mention like, oh, gee golly, yeah, I'm gonna have to go and go to court and hear what is to happen with Mr. Cunningham. And so Miss Farm is desperately asking like all the mothers to go off to have these kids be chaperoned by someone to go out to this Star Search whatever thing. And so coincidentally, Rose was the only mother who possibly didn't have anything else or better to do, because every other one of the mothers were all busy. And so we have Miss Farm, who ends up like guilt tripping Rose into doing this thing, because Rose is like, well, my husband is off town too, so I don't know if I can be able to leave my kids here. And so Miss Farm just kind of guilt trip Rose into or Mrs. Farm, Miss Farm. I don't really care about the title of whatever. So uh, Rose is just be like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So what ends up happening is Elizabeth is to find out she is to be accepted into this college. Donnie's like, great, let's throw a Halloween party. Like, because both of our parents are going to be home anyways. So, uh, so I think eventually what ends up happening is eventually Donnie is to confess that he was to have burnt Cunningham's home down, and that he was to confess to doing the thing at the school. and so that's why they were gonna like ramp up the therapy sessions and all that kind of stuff. So uh, eventually, Donnie is to have this drawing of what Frank looks like, and so Rose, before she used to go off to go to Star Search to see this like picture, and so Donnie is to ask his mother. It's like, well, like, what is it like to have a crazy son? And she's like, it's wonderful. Like, it's wonderful. Like, because I have one. Like, it doesn't matter if he's crazy or not. Like, I just have one. So that was kind of a nice moment. So, uh, so we go to this Halloween party, and I think I can do this without the IMDb and all that kind of stuff because I think I've kind of covered most of this stuff. Uh, let's cover Karen, who is Drew Barrymore's character. Uh, it seems that funding of this school ended up getting cut because I guess of the water main, and so it seems that Drew Barrymore's character ended up getting fired, and she was able to kind of make it throughout the rest of the week, and then she was going to have to find a job elsewhere. And so it's interesting how like we have Karen, who's Drew Barrymore's character, who's like, "Fa!" and then eventually she ends up seeing Chen there, and then eventually when Karen's character looks back at this girl, she's like, "Well, maybe my life isn't that bad." like, that's kind of like that's kind of sad when eventually you're looking back on this girl, like, yeah, maybe my life isn't that bad. Like, like it took her that like realization to all of a sudden just be like, well, maybe whatever. Uh, so we have this Halloween party, and so weirdly, we have one of Donnie's friends who ends up coming as some kind of bootleg or kind of weird off kind of version of Hulk Hogan. And God, I'm trying to think of what the other friend came as. I don't remember. But we have Donnie who ends up coming up as a skeleton without a skull mask because, of course, I'm like, you would have to show Donnie's face because he's star of film, and plus, like they could have just had him in makeup. Like they couldn't have spent money to just have him in some kind of skull makeup. Like they could have really treated this like Karate Kid or something like that, where they could have just skull makeup him so that way he like you could still see his dialogue, or you could still have him have dialogue. But maybe they didn't have money for makeup for this thing. I don't know. Whichever. It's too late now to figure all that out. So they could have just painted like a white face over his face, but whatever. Too late. Like he has to make out a lot, so if you don't want to smear his makeup, so cue up this party. Elizabeth is having a good time because she's gonna go off to college soon. So much so that eventually Donnie is to kind of have to wake her up. Uh, and plus, it's kind of interesting because uh, Rose is calling in the middle of the night saying that, hey, like they ended up getting like 3 stars on Star Search. So if anything, we're coming back home and we're gonna come back about like 8 something in the morning. So like they caught like the earliest plane out. So uh, anyway, so we're at this party, and so Gretchen is to find out that her mother had left. And I'm like, okay, so what are they going to do with Gretchen then? But I guess like things technically resolve itself in this film. That's a sticky wicket to have to really just mow over. So speaking of mowing over, oh, I did it again. Anyways, that was a horrible joke, but I went there because things happen in film, sadly enough. So probably much more mowing down than mowing over, but anyways, pushing on. So uh, eventually Donnie is to try to comfort Gretchen So he's like, hey, how about we go into this room and like you just kind of tell me everything, so that way like he can kind of just kind of get her like privately like away so like they can talk together. Like it's kind of interesting how like we have like plenty of times that like Donnie is to consistently just be talking to Gretchen, and every single time he's talking to Gretchen at some point after 2 weeks of their relationship, and Gretchen is to ask Donnie, it's like, well, like, do you want to kiss? And Donnie's like, well, sure. And then he ends up trying to plant one on her, and Gretchen is like, whoa, like the time has to be perfect. And then when eventually Gretchen is running off in tears because of the people like treating her like garbage, and Donnie runs after her to try to just kind of like be a shoulder to cry on for that moment, she ends up kissing him in that moment. And then eventually, like when they're at the Evil Dead thing, and after Gretchen wakes up, they end up kissing again. I'm like, man, like was was honestly Jake planning all this? Like, how many kissing things could we have in this movie? Was like the director just like, yeah, we really have to have these kids just kiss out this many of time, um, or maybe they did have some quasi relationship somewhere in this film. I don't know, between these two characters, but you wouldn't want to assess that because like they would have just been like, no, there's no. Anyways, either one of them, maybe they didn't feel it. I don't know. Maybe there was a method to their acting. I don't know. Like maybe they're just like, sure, like just have another kiss. It's okay. Like it makes sense for the scene to just have them continue to kiss all the time because they're young and they're in love. So Gretchen is to tell Donnie that her mother just left on her, and so the only thing that I guess Donnie can figure out to do to try to comfort Gretchen in this moment is to just kiss her and to continue to kiss her and then have this make out moment. And like Elizabeth is looking on as both Gretchen and Donnie are making their way up these stairs. And you always have to also remember that this is Maggie and Jake Gyllenhaal, and they're actually brother and sister. So, like, this is kind of weird to also realize that this is actually brother and sister in a brother and sister role, which I guess that's the easiest way of how they got this, but still. Uh, it's just kind of interesting to see, like, Elizabeth just kind of looking on as her brothers go up the stairs with some girl. And maybe she's like, yeah, go get him. Or maybe she's like hopefully this straightens this guy out for once. Like for the acting part of it, I don't know. Anyways, pushing on. So they end up making out, but like there isn't clothes being removed. So uh, eventually, Donnie is to go with this girl, and we eventually have them have this like weird ET moment where they're to come to this realization that like time is almost up. And so Donnie tries to desperately run to Robert Sparrow's or Roberta Sparrow's home to, I guess, have Donnie like have Roberta give him some kind of answer of how he can stop the world from ending. And so all of a sudden, we have both Gretchen and Donnie met with the two bad seeds from the earlier part of the movie, where Donnie at some point was having this bathroom argument with this one kid who ended up having this blade, and so now this kid is to come back with a much more larger kitchen knife with Seth Rogen's character. And so they end up kind of threatening these people, and just kind of like we get closer and closer to having this kid just wanting to desperately cut Donnie or to cut his throat. And so what ends up happening is Seth Rogen's character ends up seeing a car come down the road, and Seth Rogen's character is like, "Hey man, we gotta skedaddle out of here," because I think what these two guys were going to do were trying to rob Spurl's place, because it seems that Eddie, who's Donnie's father, has mentioned that it seems that there have been a number of thefts trying to be done in that house, because supposedly this woman is to quite possibly have some like gems or something like that that are really valuable, and I guess a lot of people tried to go and steal from that house. So all this to just kind of set up what I guess is to happen later on in this movie, with these two characters having these ski masks, I guess, trying to rob from this home and get interrupted by Donnie and Gretchen. So Gretchen and Donnie, I guess, were to be so beaten up that eventually, when the two thugs do run off, eventually Gretchen is trying to like get up from things, but we end up having this Trans Am who is driving far too quickly, and all of a sudden accidentally runs over the head of Gretchen, killing her instantly. And so all of a sudden we have these two characters who had run off to go and get beer for this Halloween party, and one of them ends up being this weird chicken, and the other ends up being like Frank, who is this bizarro bunny. And now we are to understand like how Frank in past has a hole in his eye from a bullet wound, because Donnie had, or because these people had run this girl over and killed the only woman that Donnie loved, really loved. And so when Frank is to get out of the car, and when Frank is to go and take his head off, or to take his like mask off, Donnie ends up going and taking this gun and shooting Frank in the head, dropping him and killing him. And so Donnie ends up telling this guy with the chicken costume to run off home to tell his parents that everything is going to be all right. Weirdly. So this kid ends up just running off, like not going and driving away. He just runs off for whatever reason. And so Donnie ends up grabbing Gretchen and is to eventually just like try to make his way back home. And then he eventually goes back home to see his like sister, who is kind of just she's kind of like hungover from all the partying. And so Donnie takes Gretchen, I guess, to this hospital, or is going to try to take her to the hospital, even though she's already dead. There's probably nothing he can do. So the very, I think, last thing that we are to see here is all of a sudden to have Donnie Darko now back in his room, kind of laughing away, just just laughing away, because I guess there was nothing for him to do about the world ending. There was no way he could stop it. There was no way to like figure it out. It was just that he was just to be meant to be in this room when this jet engine was to fall, and even when this time traveler supposedly, or just Donnie's psychic ability, was to prevent him from being in that room during that specific time. Like, it created this this thing where like it was going to end the world and force Donnie to go back to that same time to correct the whole like Donnie having this psychic ability and whatever, because he should not have been alive during any point of that time for him to do any of this stuff. So, like, I think that was the most interesting thing about this movie. And so, supposedly, the jet engine was to come from Rose and his sister's plane. So, we just have to probably assume that that plane probably crashed in the future because of the horrible tornado like weather. And that jet engine landed on this house in a past time, which this time around, Donnie was actually there in that room and died. And so all of his folks were to be out of the house because they were in the same spot that they were before. And so now they were all mourning the loss over Donnie because he ended up getting crushed by this jet engine and so ended up getting hauled out via this ambulance. And so Gretchen, who is now not killed because this is a past time, is to just kind of mention, hey, what happened? And so they end up mentioning that Donnie Darko had died. And so Gretchen bizarrely waves at Rose and then just kind of just bikes off of like, what could have been? Well, what could have been is Gretchen could have died. So luckily in this time period, Gretchen may or may not have like died in this timeline. Like that's the kind of interesting thing about timelines or time loops or time whatever, that like maybe this was going back and kind of like Final Destination correcting something that should have happened anyways, but for some power that was of Donnie Darko's, like this should not have happened, but it did. So with that said, I think I covered most of this movie. Hopefully people are okay with this review. This kind of went in all kinds of other kind of things, and like this was not done perfectly. I can admit that. There was probably a bunch of scenes that I probably didn't get to. I tried to. So there's that. I'm going to get the heck out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. And hopefully there's not a huge debate about any of this stuff. That's not what I tried to do when I did this review. I just saw this movie and I was like, okay, let me say these things. And hopefully nobody took any of these things the wrong way or do not like me because I said something somewhere and maybe was taken out of whatever and ooh gee golly, whichever. So I'm sorry if anybody was offended by anything that I said here, because that might be a possibility, but freaking whatever. I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.